All right, everybody. Welcome to Salon Series. I'm Jenna Harris. I'm the Education Manager for YOLO Arts, and I work with the curators of the Barn Gallery and the Yolo County Historical Collection to develop this speaker series with the goal of exploring ideas relevant to our community. I would like to open today's event by acknowledging the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been home of the Patwin people, including Yochadihi Winton Nation today. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. Before we get started, I do have a bunch of upcoming events, which I have flyers or postcards for everything, so don't feel like you have to remember all the dates, but you can absolutely grab some before you go. First up is our show at Gallery 625, Stuck Together and Torn Apart, Process and Printmaking in the Pandemic. And that is on view through the end of March over on Court Street at the Irwin Meyer Administration Building, Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Coming up next week, I hope you guys have another Thursday evening free. Our show that's installed here in the Barn Gallery that you're getting a bit of a sneak preview of tonight, and our show over at the Barn Gallery, both are part of the National Council on Education for Ceramic Arts convention that's going on in the area, and SECA for those who, like the shorter alliteration like I do. The show here is after Viola, and the show in the house is called Side by Side. It's contemporary and historic ceramic pairings, and we'll be having our opening reception next Thursday at 5 p.m. So these are these two postcards here. And then coming up, if you cannot get enough of Julia, she will be joining us for the Women's History Celebration at the Gibson House on March 26th. It's part of an event providing healing and promoting hope that features a variety of female speakers. And then, of course, save the date for next month's Salon Series. We have Julia Schwartz, who's the Director of Admin and Development of the Artist Legacy Foundation, and she is presenting on our exhibition here in the Barn Gallery, and her talk is titled Viola Fry, Finding Inspiration. And of course, for all my plant people in the audience, we do have a plant sale every Thursday morning from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. So please come on by, check out. Our propagators have a great selection kind of on the other side of the property back behind us here. And we would love your support over there. So now I get to introduce our wonderful speaker. Julia Levine received her MFA in poetry from Pacific University, as well as a PhD in child and family clinical psychology. She has published 5 full-length collections of poetry, and her most recent awards include the Public Poetry, Bellevue Literary Review, and, correct me if I'm saying this wrong, the Tiferet. Close enough? The Tiferet Poetry Prize, as well as the Northern California Book Award in Poetry. Levine is currently serving as the City of Davis Poet Laureate with an emphasis on poetry of the, I looked up how to pronounce it ahead of time, Anthropocene?
That's perfect.
Yes, Anthropocene. We are so excited to collaborate with Julia on a number of events, but for us, she's partnering with our Art and Ag program to create the Plein Air Poets. If you're a beginner or experienced poet, we encourage you to join the Art and Ag mailing list so that you're aware of the events. We do monthly visits to the farms. So without any further ado, Julia, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, I did make it over this. It's so nice that you guys came. Thank you so much. I really envisioned this as having my friend Ruth and my husband and the people who put this on. So to the rest of you, thank you so much. And this really, I really do hope this is a discussion. I'm going to blah, blah, blah for not very long, and then I'm going to ask some questions which I really hope people are willing to share their thoughts about. Because I don't have the answer whether poetry matters, but the name of my talk is, Does Poetry Matter in a Time of Drastic Uncertainty? And first I want to thank Jenna and Yulia and Janice, who's visiting her daughter. I found out that I actually know, because this world's so small. She's not here right now. But I want to thank everyone for asking me to this Salon series. And I was asked first to speak about my term as the current Poet Laureate of Davis, as well as read a little of my work. So what I did was I came up with a rather short little speech that has multiple parts to it. And you're only going to have to listen to a very few very short poems. And then I'm going to talk about some of the things I've thought a lot about as the Poet Laureate with a special interest in the Anthropocene. But I have heard people say Anthropocene, so I'm sure it wasn't wrong. And as you all probably know, the Anthropocene is our current geological era, defined by the fact that human activity is the dominant force acting on our planet, primarily in the release of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. And I'm just going to say it more simply, which is we know that this one and only planet we have is in big trouble. And we are probably the major cause of this change. And we hear every day on the news about wildfires, floods, landslides, extinctions, ocean acidification, and droughts. And even now, as we sit here, the West is in the longest drought since 800 AD, which I think is a pretty long drought. We can't argue with facts. Well, I guess we can actually. But it also seems very difficult to know what we can do about global warming, especially in a way that makes it a measurable difference. So, like, you know, they don't give you straws anymore. If you buy a metal straw or even a Prius, is that going to change the rate at which our poor planet is melting? I don't actually know. And if that's not bad enough, there's a lot of complexities involved in being a human being during the Anthropocene. And one involves, and a pretty major one, involves our capacity to understand time. So climate change is occurring on a geological time clock that is in many ways imperceptible to humans. For example, our collective existence on this planet is about 0.12% of the Earth's total lifespan. To me, that number seems really, really small, but I don't know how small. I don't really know what that means. I mean, I can say I do, but I don't. Or to say it another way, the Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years. So I get that's really old. But how is a billion different than a million? Like, if you told me 4.5 million versus 4.5 billion, I wouldn't really know the difference in terms of what that feels like. So time is one difficulty we're having. Another difficulty is our understanding about the Anthropocene because of the simultaneity of experience that a digital age creates. You know what, I'm going to stop for a minute. If you guys have any questions while I'm talking, if anything I say doesn't make sense, please interrupt me, because I've thought a lot about all this, and I've written about it, but it may not be making sense to you, so please feel free to ask any questions. So there's this difficulty in understanding because we have this simultaneity of experience in a digital age. So rather than knowing only about our little patch of dirt here, we all see on screens what is happening continents away. So, you know, how do we really take in the idea of climate change? When it's really lovely here in Yolo County, like it's been, but there is a terrible flood in the east and devastating hurricanes in Asia, how do we make sense of it? And when we have gorgeous sunny days that are 10 to 15 degrees above normal, are we lucky, or is it ominous, or is it both? And I don't know how to process that. So that's my first little bit. My second bit, I don't know whether poetry matters or not. I just write because I cannot stop writing. I've written ever since I was 5 years old, and my dad thought what I had to say was interesting, which my dad never thought anything I had to say was interesting. And he typed it up on his typewriter, and I was hooked. I was like, oh my God, I got my dad's attention. But I've never stopped writing. I don't know how else to be in this world, and that is not a very convincing argument in favor of poetry making a difference in global warming. I do know that the question of why write poetry when it can't save anyone has actually been asked before. Your timer's going off, darling. Did you have a question? Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit. I do know that this question of why write poetry when it can't save anyone's life has been asked before. Czesław Miłosz, who fled Poland during World War II and was a Nobel Prize winner, wrote in a poem called Dedication, "What is poetry which does not save nations or people?" He struggled his entire life with this question, and he was haunted with survivor guilt, as well as questions as how to live in a world that was so filled with genocide and massacre and injustice. Poetry cannot save a life by itself. You know, if someone has been hit by a bomb and you read them a poem, it's not going to help them. If you go back a little bit, I do think poetry gives voice to those whose voices have been erased or are silent or can't speak for themselves for whatever reason. And it does have power in its capacity to contain emotional truth. So that means that it contains darkness as well as beauty. And a lot of what we don't do, at least in this country, is talk about the darkness. You know, we're really good at saying, oh my God, I'm so blessed. I had such a great day. My kids are so perfect. You know, the weather's so nice. We don't really say, I feel so lonely. I'm so worried about the planet. So I want to start, I wasn't planning to do this, but of course I didn't also plan the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Hard to believe, but I really had nothing to do with it. I want to read this poem of Miłosz as an example of this ability to speak for the voiceless. And I also want to read it in honor of all of the Ukrainian victims. This is a poem, his collected poems are like this big, so you're really lucky I'm not talking about him. This comes from a poem called 6 Lectures in Verse, and they really are 6 lectures. But this one I thought was particularly beautiful and I think really speaks to this question of what is poetry that cannot save a life or a nation? And this is lecture 4. And again, this is Czesław Miłosz, not me. Reality, what can we do with it? Where is it in words? Just as it flickers, it vanishes. Innumerable lives unremembered, cities on maps only, without that face in the window, on the first floor, by the market, without those 2 in the bushes near the gas plant. Returning seasons, mountain snows, oceans, and the blue ball of the earth rotates, but silent are they who threw artillery fire, who clung to a lump of clay for protection, and those deported from their homes at dawn, and those who have crawled out from under a pile of bodies, while here I, an instructor in forgetting, teach that pain passes, for it's the pain of others. Still in my mind, trying to save Miss Wadwiga, a little hunchback, librarian by profession, who perished in the shelter of an apartment house that was considered safe but toppled down, and no one was able to dig through the slabs of wall, though knocking and voices were heard for many days. So a name is lost for ages, forever. No one will ever know about her last hours. Time carries her in layers of the Pliocene. The true enemy of man is generalization. The true enemy of man, so-called history, attracts and terrifies with its plural number. Don't believe it. Cunning and treacherous. History is not, as Marx told us, anti-nature. And if a goddess of blind fate. The little skeleton of Miss Wadwiga, the spot where her heart was pulsating, This only I set against necessity, law, theory. That was Czesław Miłosz. I think that is such a beautiful poem. So I could argue that the necessity of poetry in the Anthropocene has to do with the intimacy and emotional resonance of poetry versus the sort of cold, distant, technological language of science and mass media. That is, if facts feel detached and unreal, experiences are different. Poetry attempts to create an experience for the reader. As Jory Graham, who's a very famous poet, as Jory Graham put it, readers feel they know this information already, so why do they need it in a poem? But that is precisely the point. Knowing is not feeling. So I'm trying to make this distinction between emotion and knowing, or facts, whatever you want to call it. No questions so far. Am I making sense? Okay. Additionally, environmental writers have pointed out that to create a binary between humans and other living beings on this planet is false and creates the conditions for exploitation of resources. Poetry has great potential for creating a sense of empathy and community with all beings, not just human ones. And then finally, and I think this is really important, how can we struggle to understand what being human during the Anthropocene means without art and poetry to help us see it, feel it, know it in that way? Some argue that in the next century, when the planet will be in far hotter and in far more trouble than it is now, people will want a record of what we thought and felt during this period. And poetry will be one important way of recording this. So that's 2, now I'm on to 3. And I'm going to talk about writing elegies to ourselves, i.e. human extinction. Over the last century, species are dying out. This is so cheerful, I know. But I think the urgency cannot be amped up enough myself. So thank you for going on this depressing ride with me. Over the last century, species are dying out up to 114 times faster than they would have without human activity. That means the number of species that went extinct in the past 100 years would have taken 11,400 years to go extinct under natural extinction rates. That is why the Anthropocene era is considered to be the 6th mass extinction. It is unlikely that humans will be completely wiped out, but there is probably nothing more profoundly unsettling to me than the idea of human civilization disappearing. It took a long time for us to develop written language, symbolic thinking, the capacity to create music and art and theater. And I think humanity has brought so much to the world, it makes me want to cry to think of it destroyed, especially its capacity to make meaning and story. So now I'm going to read a poem of mine that's dealing with this idea of making meaning and story out of this. And this poem is called The Rainmaker. After drought, I walk a fire road, listening to the creek fall through underbrush, the storm starting up again, hard against the fire-scorched ridge. Out of season, a wild iris unlocks its silver-blue blades. I've mistaken the world as willing, because beauty has always saved me. Beauty in the green December fields, beauty in these 3 mushrooms, one a wine red, one a pale bell, one a shaggy parasol sent up from the threaded underground. Here the sky brightens, the rain stops. Fast-moving clouds tear open a porthole. Even if I am extinction's accomplice, I want to remember hope. I want to feel this apocalyptic tenderness for our blundered, perilous passing through. Now a raven squawks at me from a Douglas fir. Weren't we always in this together? Sometimes I think we are not a failed species, but perfectly designed to want and lament, exalt and ruin and disappear, then I think how much will die with us. Still, if I watch that great bird lift up, beat its way through those clouds, isn't a story, a myth, a lie exactly what we were evolved to make? Especially a beautiful one. The raven hurtling its arrow into the white storehouse of sky, and the rain through a beak-shaped puncture beginning to fall again. 4. We're almost there, guys. One of my favorite books right now is this glossary of terms for writing about the Anthropocene called CounterDesecration. And there's terms in here that are meant to sort of jostle your framework, to keep language vital and alive, and to provoke possibilities for writing responsively to the Anthropocene. In this book, I have learned many strange and at times beautiful terms, such as solastalgia, meaning psychic or existential distress caused by environmental change. Or, I love this one, phytosentience, which refers to plant intelligence and the neurological apparatus that makes even a human aware of rousing to light, becoming stressed or unstressed in varying temperatures, as well as acknowledging touch. So we have this kind of intelligence, phytosentience, that plants have as well. This glossary, this book, brings to mind the great poet Paul Salon. Salon survived the Holocaust, and he was in, I think he was in Auschwitz, actually, so he really had it bad. And he survived, but he felt that as a German-speaking Jew, he felt estranged from his own native language. So he set about creating his own language through a process of what he called dismantling and rewelding German. And like Salon and many others, similar questions regarding language, as well as structure, form, and function of poetry, have been raised by poets of the Anthropocene, meaning, if we're going to write poetry about the climate crisis, do we need to create new language, new forms, new ideas about poetry? I have this brilliant colleague, Jonathan Keats, who has made several clocks out of rivers and trees to try and demonstrate in a felt and experienced way what time feels like on a larger environmental scale. For example, he's currently working on a clock in Atlanta, Georgia that displays not the minutes and seconds that we're used to seeing, but time that moves faster or slower based on how fast the Chattahoochee River is running. Poetry can also help with this kind of chronodiversity, the diversity of time. Unlike many other forms of literature, there is a compression of space and time in poems. There is the dream logic of a poem that does not require narrative or logical time. Poems can be fragmented, can enact this experience I was talking about earlier of simultaneity. Without a larger than human scale of time, we have an innate difficulty in conceptualizing climate change as an urgent, here and now emergency. And our language, I think, mirrors this confusion. So for example, the word late can mean later in the day, like it was late in the day, later in the epoch, late in the 21st century. It can mean behind schedule. I myself am often late. And it can also mean dead, like my late father. So I'm going to read a very short poem about that. This is called Too Late Pastoral. And pastoral, just so you know, is an old term in poetry when poets saw nature as very soothing and consoling, as sort of an answer to problems. So this is a too late pastoral. What light did to the day could still startle you. Sky and field and marsh shot through with sun, especially in a late January afternoon, too late really to be heading into the park, but you did. You knew the trail, the granitic cliffs red and rising straight up from sand, the sea turning molten. You stood for an hour and watched the surf knock at a heron's thin silhouette, her crest feathers wild in the wind. It was good then to walk back in the near dark through the almost gone hills. Near the gate, a coyote stopped and stared before she leapt the fence, and it was late, almost too late in the world. So you stayed as the star thistles bent a moment, quivering, to watch how, within it, the field held the vanishing. That's what I would call a dark pastoral. This is a new term that kind of undoes this idealized romantic notion of nature when we live in a landscape ravaged by drought, wildfires, increasing heat, or flooding like they're having right now in Australia. And I'm going to read one more. It's called Walking the Berryessa Fire's Aftermath. So my husband and I drove up to try to find a place to hike, and the only place we could find was right through, literally through piles of ash. And this was the poem I wrote about that. Walking the Berryessa Fire's Aftermath. We find a jagged gap in the barbed wire and slip inside. It is February, spring lifting strands of fillery, soaproot through black meadows of ash. This is the atomized afterwards of live oak and digger pines. This is inventory and premonition, the vaporized acres of manzanita, blackened turtle shells upturned in a dry creek bed. This is the steep road a prison crew cut, littered with beer cans alchemized into featherweight discs. This is a torched silence, and when you kneel to show me a blistered jawbone, our brief and perishing flesh leans in to listen. One of the terms in this CounterDesecration glossary is way-dwelling. Way-dwelling refers to the unfamiliar foothold of immediacy. I love that. Unfamiliar foothold of immediacy, meaning, you're not looking at your phone, you're not listening to it bark at you. It's an involuntary surrender to place and time. Children are really good at this. But as we educate them, this tension sort of arises between their ability to surrender entirely to a place. I wrote this poem I'm going to read 30 years ago before I had ever heard of global warming. But now when I reread it, it reminds me that the Anthropocene has one gift that it has given me, which is reminding me that not only is an individual life finite, but so is that of our planet. So this poem is called Why Numbers Never End. We walked to water through a field of star thistle, spores shivering in wind. She was counting as high as she could, while my hands lifted a blaze of hair from her lips. I was thinking how my quarry of jeans laddered her legs and arms as we knelt in the river's muck, watching knots of minnow and tadpoles interrupt the shadows. She was 4 years old when she asked me why the numbers never end. And I didn't know why perfection allows us near enough to grieve. I only knew that the wholeness of her world was about to change. So I said, look at the river, and she saw water, endlessly counting itself over stones and the blue, blue hills. So that is the end of my little lecture.